The sun set slowly over the jagged mountains of Rocker, casting an eerie glow across the barren wilderness. Thala stumbled through the thick underbrush, her once elegant robes torn and muddied from her desperate flight. She could feel the oppressive weight of the forest closing in on her. Each step she took was filled with dread, as if the very ground beneath her feet were alive, watching her, waiting for her to falter. Her people had abandoned her, cast her aside like a broken tool no longer of use. The Zorans were proud, but their pride often led to cruel decisions. Thala had been one of the promising young candidates chosen to serve in the royal court, a privilege most could only dream of. But a single mistake, a minor misstep in protocol, had cost her everything. Thala's mind raced back to the moment when her own kin had turned their backs on her. Her heart ached as she recalled the cold eyes of her superiors, the swift judgment, and the final sentence that sealed her fate. Banishment to the wilds of Rocker, a death sentence in all but name. The Zorans knew what lay beyond the protective walls of their cities. Rocker was home to creatures that defied comprehension, beasts with teeth like blades, eyes that gleamed with unnatural hunger, and skin thicker than armor. No one survived in the wilderness. It was a graveyard for the lost, the condemned, and the forgotten. Thala collapsed against a tree, her breath ragged as she struggled to keep her wits about her. She could hear the distant howls of the creatures that roamed the land. Night was approaching, and with it, the true terror of Rocker. She reached into the small satchel slung across her shoulder, her fingers brushing against the meager supplies her captors had left her with. A small blade, a handful of dried rations, and a single vial of water. Hardly enough to last her a day, let alone survive in this hellish landscape. Her sharp, alien eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of safety. But there was none. The jagged peaks loomed in the distance, and the thick forest stretched endlessly in every direction. She was alone, truly alone. Thala's body trembled as a wave of despair washed over her. She cursed her weakness. She had been trained in diplomacy, in the art of persuasion, not in survival. What use was her knowledge of court etiquette here, where the only rule was to kill or be killed? A rustling in the bushes nearby snapped her out of her thoughts. Her heart raced as she gripped the small blade in her hand, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. She stood slowly, her muscles tense, her eyes wide as she scanned the darkness for the source of the sound. Then, she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes watching her from the shadows. A low growl rumbled through the air, sending chills down her spine. The creature stepped into the faint light, revealing its grotesque form. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a hulking beast with jagged scales, sharp claws, and a maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. The stench of decay wafted from its breath as it eyed her hungrily. Thala backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew there was no escape. The beast would strike at any moment. She was nothing more than prey to it, a weak and defenseless offering to the monsters of Rocker. Just as the creature crouched, preparing to pounce, a sudden flash of light erupted from the tree-line. Thala barely had time to react as a deafening crack filled the air, and the beast let out a shriek of agony. A burst of fire lit up the night, and the monster crumpled to the ground, its body twitching in its final moments. Thala's eyes widened in shock as a figure emerged from the shadows, clad in strange, metallic armor. A human? Her mind reeled in disbelief. The humans were a primitive species, weak and unremarkable in the eyes of the Zoran. What was one doing here, on the most dangerous planet in the sector? The human approached, his face partially obscured by a helmet that glowed faintly in the dim light. He raised a strange weapon, scanning the area for any more threats before turning to face her. "You're lucky I was nearby," he said, his voice calm but filled with a hint of urgency. "This place is crawling with these things. You shouldn't be out here alone." Thala blinked, still in shock. She had never seen a human up close before, and certainly not one in armor like this. He was taller than she had expected, his frame solid and powerful. But it wasn't just his appearance that startled her, it was his presence. There was something about the way he moved, the way he spoke, that made her uneasy. This was no ordinary human. She struggled to find her voice. Who are you?" The man removed his helmet, revealing a sharp, rugged face with short-cropped hair and piercing blue eyes. His gaze was intense, but not unkind. "Name's Captain Jason Carter, and you're about to owe me your life, if we don't move." Before Thala could respond, Another growl echoed through the trees. Jason's face hardened, and he grabbed her arm, pulling her along as he led her deeper into the forest. His grip was firm but not painful, and despite the danger, she found herself feeling a strange sense of relief in his presence. As they ran, dodging low-hanging branches and uneven terrain, Thala couldn't shake the question from her mind. Why had this human saved her? What could he possibly want in return? Chapter 2. A Fragile Alliance. The tension between Thala and Jason was palpable as they continued through the wilds of Rocker. Thala kept glancing at him, her thoughts racing. She had been raised to believe that humans were inferior, weak, impulsive creatures barely capable of functioning within galactic society. Yet here he was, guiding her through one of the deadliest environments in the galaxy with a calmness she had never seen before. They moved quickly, Jason leading her with an almost instinctive awareness of the terrain. Thala, exhausted and battered from her earlier ordeal, struggled to keep up but forced herself to stay close. The creatures of Rocker might be quiet for now, but she knew they were never far away. Finally, Jason stopped, crouching down behind a large tree. He motioned for her to follow his lead, scanning the surrounding jungle with sharp, practiced eyes. "We should be safe here for a bit," he said, his voice low but steady. "But we can't stay out in the open for long." Thala collapsed against the tree, her legs barely able to hold her up anymore. She watched Jason as he pulled out a small device from his pack, scanning the area with what she assumed was some kind of motion detector. His equipment was more advanced than she had expected, clearly military grade. "You're human," she finally said, her voice still filled with disbelief. "Why would you risk your life for someone like me?" Jason didn't look at her immediately, focusing instead on his readings. But after a moment, he sighed and met her gaze. "Does it matter?" he asked. "You needed help, and I was here. I don't exactly make a habit of leaving people to die." Thala frowned. In her experience, everyone had ulterior motives, especially in situations like this. She had expected a demand for something in return, some price she would have to pay for her life. But Jason's straightforward response caught her off guard. "You don't know what I've done," she said quietly, staring at the ground. "My own people thought I was worth abandoning." Jason raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a ration bar, handing it to her. "Eat," he said. "You'll need your strength if we're going to make it through the night." Thala hesitated. The Zorans prided themselves on their self-sufficiency. Taking help from a human felt like an insult to everything she had been taught. But her stomach growled, and she knew that pride wouldn't keep her alive in this hostile environment. Reluctantly, she took the bar, nibbling at it as she watched Jason set up a small perimeter with motion sensors. After a few moments, Jason sat down opposite her, leaning against a fallen log. His expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the surrounding jungle as if he expected an attack at any moment. "You're not the first to be left behind," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "This planet's been used as a dumping ground for as long as I've been stationed in this sector. Criminals, political exiles, people who've outlived their usefulness. They all end up here eventually." Thala clenched her fists, the shame of her situation weighing heavily on her. "I wasn't a criminal," she said, her voice bitter. "I was a diplomat. One mistake, and they threw me to the beasts." Jason nodded, but didn't press her for details. "That's the way of the galaxy sometimes," he said simply. "People in power make decisions for their own benefit, and the rest of us pay the price." Thala looked at him, surprised by the hint of understanding in his words. For a moment, she felt a connection to him, a shared experience of being cast aside by those who should have protected them. But she quickly pushed the thought away. He was human, and she couldn't afford to trust him, no matter how kind he seemed. "What's your plan?" she asked, changing the subject. Jason shrugged. "Get us off this planet. There's an old outpost about a day's trek from here. If we can make it, I should be able to call for a pickup." Thala's eyes widened. "An outpost? Here?" Jason nodded. "It's abandoned now, but there should still be some working comms equipment. If we're lucky, we can get a signal out." Thala's heart raced. The thought of escaping this nightmare was more than she had dared to hope for. But there was still one question burning in her mind. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jason looked at her, his blue eyes piercing through her defenses. "Because I don't leave people behind," he said simply. "It's not who I am." For the first time since her exile, Thala felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, She had found an ally in this desolate place. Chapter 3. The Beasts of Rocker. The day had not yet fully broken when Jason and Thala began their trek toward the abandoned outpost. The thick canopy overhead let in only the faintest traces of sunlight, casting long shadows across the jungle floor. The air was dense with humidity, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the faint odor of decay. Rocker's wilderness was still, but it was the kind of stillness that Thala had come to understand meant danger. Jason, however, moved through the underbrush as if he had done it 100 times before. His steps were measured, each one deliberate, avoiding the crunch of dead leaves or the snap of twigs underfoot. Thala followed closely behind, trying to mirror his movements as best as she could, though her every muscle screamed with exhaustion. "How much farther?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the jungle itself were alive and watching them. She glanced behind them, half expecting to see one of Rocker's monstrous creatures lurking in the shadows. "Another 6 or 7 hours, if we keep up this pace," Jason replied without turning around. His voice was low but calm, giving no indication of fear. "We'll need to move quickly. The longer we stay out here, the more likely we'll run into something nasty." Thala had seen enough of Rocker's beasts to know he was right. The creature from the night before was only one of many that roamed the planet. There were rumors in her homeworld about Rocker tales told to scare children into obedience. But being here, witnessing the sheer hostility of the environment, Thala realized those stories barely scratched the surface of the terror this planet held. They moved through the jungle in silence for some time, the only sound being the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional distant growl from the depths of the forest. Thala couldn't help but admire Jason's ability to navigate such a deadly environment. Every time they approached a particularly dense thicket or a suspiciously quiet clearing, Jason would stop, scanning the area with those sharp, calculating eyes of his before leading them on a safe path. He moved with a kind of quiet confidence, as if he had faced these dangers many times before. Thala, on the other hand, felt entirely out of her depth. Her training as a diplomat had not prepared her for this. Negotiating peace treaties, navigating political intrigue, even managing tense interspecies relations, those were skills she had honed over years of study. But here, in the wilds of Rocker, none of that mattered. It was survival, pure and simple, and Jason was the one with the knowledge to ensure it. As they continued their journey, Thala's mind wandered back to her people, the Zorans who had abandoned her. The memory of their cold, unfeeling faces when they sentenced her to this fate still stung. The elders had judged her too quickly, eager to cast her out as a scapegoat for their own failures. She had been so proud when she was selected to serve the royal court, believing she could make a real difference in her people's future. But all it had taken was one mistake, one failed negotiation with a neighboring empire, and they had turned on her, eager to offer her as a sacrifice to the wilderness of Rocker. It was easier to blame her than to admit their own shortcomings. Thala clenched her fists, feeling a surge of anger. She had been abandoned to die among monsters, and yet it was a human species her people considered beneath them who had saved her life. The irony wasn't lost on her. Jason suddenly raised a hand, signaling for her to stop. Thala froze, her heart racing as she scanned the jungle around them. She could see nothing out of the ordinary, but Jason's tense posture told her otherwise. "Something's following us," Jason said in a low voice. He slowly turned his head, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the thick underbrush behind them. "Stay close to me." Thala's pulse quickened, and her hand instinctively went to the small blade Jason had given her earlier. She could feel the weight of the jungle pressing down on her, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint sound of rustling leaves. "Is it one of the beasts?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Her throat felt tight, her body trembling with the anticipation of whatever was stalking them. Jason's eyes flicked to her, his expression unreadable. Maybe, or it could be something worse. Before Thala could ask what he meant, a low growl echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. The sound was deep and guttural, far too close for comfort. Jason's hand tightened around the grip of his weapon, his body tensing like a coiled spring. "Get ready to run," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "If things go south, you head toward the outpost. Don't look back, and don't stop for anything. Understand?" Thala swallowed hard, nodding even though every instinct screamed at her to do the opposite. How could she leave him behind? He was her only chance of survival. Jason crouched low, his eyes scanning the area with laser focus. The growling grew louder, closer, and Thala could see the faint outline of something moving through the trees, a massive, hulking shape that sent her heart racing. Then, without warning, the creature lunged from the shadows, its massive body crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. It was larger than the beast from the night before, its dark, scaly skin gleaming in the dim light. Its eyes glowed with hunger as it locked onto them, letting out a deafening roar that reverberated through the jungle. "Run!" Jason shouted, firing his weapon in a burst of bright, electric blue energy. The creature recoiled, but it wasn't enough to stop its charge. Thala didn't need to be told twice. She turned and bolted, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her through the thick foliage. Branches whipped at her face, and her feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but she didn't stop. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of Jason's weapon firing, followed by the enraged roars of the creature as it tore through the jungle in pursuit. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred, but still she ran. The outpost, she had to reach the outpost. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches forming a labyrinth that made it nearly impossible to see a clear path. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. Fear gripped her, threatening to paralyze her, but she forced herself to keep moving. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way, and Thala stumbled, tumbling down a steep incline. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. For a moment, she lay there, dazed and disoriented, the world spinning around her. When she finally regained her senses, she realized she had fallen into a small ravine, hidden from view by the thick canopy above. The sounds of the creature's roars were distant now, but she could still hear them, echoing through the jungle like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Thala struggled to her feet, wincing at the sharp pain in her side. She glanced around, trying to get her bearings. There was no sign of Jason, and the realization sent a surge of panic through her. Had he been killed? Had the creature caught up to him while she ran? No, she couldn't think like that. Jason was a soldier, he knew how to survive. He had saved her once, and she had to believe he could save himself. Taking a deep breath, Thala began to climb out of the ravine, using the roots and rocks to pull herself up. Her body ached, and her muscles screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. When she finally reached the top, she crouched low, scanning the area for any sign of danger. The jungle was quiet again, but she knew that didn't mean it was safe. Thala hesitated, unsure of which direction to go. The outpost was still hours away, and without Jason, she wasn't sure she could make it on her own. But she had no choice. She had to keep moving. Just as she was about to take a step forward, a sound behind her made her freeze. A soft rustle, the snap of a twig. Thala turned slowly, her heart in her throat. And there, standing just a few feet away, was Jason, battered and bruised but alive. His weapon was slung over his shoulder, and his face was set in a grim expression. "Thought I told you not to look back," he said, his voice rough but filled with relief. Thala let out a shaky laugh, her body sagging with exhaustion. "I didn't." Jason smirked, but the moment of levity was brief. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the jungle with the same intensity as before. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his tone serious once again. "That thing is still out there, and it's not going to stop until it finds us." Thala nodded, her determination renewed. "Then let's not give it the chance." And with that, they pressed on, the weight of the jungle pressing down on them as they made their way toward the outpost, knowing that the true battle was still to come. Chapter 4. The Last Stand. The sun was beginning to set once more, casting long shadows across the jungle as Jason and Thala approached the outpost. It was a crumbling, dilapidated structure, barely visible through the thick vines and overgrowth that had claimed it over the years. But to Thala, it was the first sign of hope she had seen since her exile. Jason led the way, his weapon at the ready, scanning the perimeter for any signs of danger. The outpost was abandoned, just as he had said, but that didn't mean it was safe. Creatures like the one that had chased them were known to take refuge in places like this, and Thala could feel the weight of their presence even as they stepped inside. The interior of the outpost was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay. Broken machinery and discarded supplies littered the floor, and the walls were covered in strange, alien symbols that Thala didn't recognize. Jason moved quickly, heading straight for a small console in the corner of the room. "Help me get this powered up," he said, pulling out a small device from his pack. "If we can get the comms online, I can call for extraction." Thala nodded, though she had no idea how any of the technology worked. She followed his instructions, helping him reroute power to the console and praying that the ancient equipment still functioned. Minutes passed in tense silence as Jason worked, his fingers flying over the controls. Thala stood by the entrance, her heart pounding as she kept watch for any signs of the creatures that had been hunting them. Just as Jason managed to get the comms array online, a deafening roar echoed through the jungle, sending chills down Thala's spine. She turned, her eyes widening as she saw movement in the trees. The creature had found them, and it was coming fast. "Jason!" she shouted, panic rising in her chest. Jason didn't hesitate. He grabbed his weapon and rushed to her side, his face set in grim determination. "We need to hold it off long enough for the signal to go through," he said, his voice calm despite the situation. Thala swallowed hard, gripping her small blade tightly. She knew they were outmatched. There was no way they could defeat the creature in direct combat. But they had no other choice. The creature burst through the tree line, its massive form illuminated by the fading light of the setting sun. Its eyes gleamed with hunger, and its jaws dripped with saliva as it let out another bone-chilling roar. Jason fired his weapon, the electric blue blast striking the creature's thick hide, but it barely slowed down. The beast charged toward them, its claws tearing through the ground as it closed the distance. Thala's heart raced as she tried to think of any plan that could buy them time. And then, she saw it. The crumbling structure of the outpost, weakened by years of neglect. If they could lure the creature inside, maybe just maybe they could bring it down on top of it. "Jason!" she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "The outpost, it's unstable. We can collapse it on the creature." Jason's eyes flicked to the building, and a brief smile crossed his face. "Not a bad idea," he said, already moving toward the structure. "But we need to move fast." Together, they ran toward the outpost, the creature hot on their heels. Jason fired another volley of shots, keeping the beast at bay as they darted inside the crumbling building. "Get ready," Jason said, his voice tight with focus. "I'll lure it in. You take out the supports." Thala nodded, her hands shaking as she gripped her blade. She moved quickly, slicing through the weak beams that held up the roof. The walls groaned in protest, the structure teetering on the edge of collapse. Jason fired one last shot, drawing the creature's attention as he darted toward the entrance. The beast roared in fury and charged after him, its massive body crashing through the doorway just as the roof began to give way. "Now!" Jason shouted. Thala swung her blade with all her strength, severing the last support beam. The roof caved in with a deafening crash, burying the creature beneath a mountain of debris. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the rubble shifted, and the creature let out one final, pained roar before falling still. Thala collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. She could hardly believe they had done it. The creature was dead, and they were alive. Jason stood over her, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, but there was a glint of triumph in his eyes. "We made it," he said, offering her a hand. Thala took it, her heart still racing. "We made it," she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. As they stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of the outpost, the faint sound of a comm signal crackled to life. Help was on the way. Thala looked at Jason, a strange sense of gratitude and respect filling her chest. She had been left to die among monsters, but this unexpected ally, had saved her life. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to humans than she had been taught.